Welcome to Lawyerpreneur, where we discuss the alternate paths that allow lawyers to engage their entrepreneurialism and distinguish themselves from others, because being a lawyer doesn't have to mean doing business as usual. I'm your host, Jeremy Richter. Today's episode is brought to you by Alps Insurance, the nation's largest direct writer of lawyers' malpractice insurance. Founded for lawyers by lawyers over 30 years ago, Alps works directly with your firm, no broker or agent, and if you do have a claim, the Alps claims handling team is comprised of actual attorneys, all with private experience. Alps roots for the law firms they protect. They believe in your success and nurture your endeavors with industry-leading coverage, risk management resources, and accredited CLEs, offering practical advice for pioneering lawyers like you. And Alps has the slickest online application out there. Qualifying firms can apply, see rates, and bind coverage in about 20 minutes. Right now, you can get 25% off one CLE seminar from Alps. Go to alpsinsurance.com/CLE. That's ALPS insurance.com/CLE and use the promo code Lawyerpreneur upon checkout. In addition to the corporate sponsorship that helps pay for the hosting and transcription of the show, you can support Lawyerpreneur on Patreon at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. For less than the cost of a .1, you can help pay for the time it takes in creating and editing Lawyerpreneur and receive copies of my two most recent books, Stop Putting Out Fires and Level Up Your Law Practice. Now, on to the interview. My guest today is John Hart. He is a former criminal defense lawyer and stockbroker from North Carolina, turned New York Times best-selling author of books like The Last Child and his brand new book, The Unwilling. John, welcome to Lawyerpreneur.
Hey, thank you, Jeremy. I'm really happy to be with you today.
All right, let's start with this. You're from North Carolina. I went back and looked after we scheduled this interview, and I read The Last Child in 2011. That was the first book of yours that I read, and I've been reading them ever since. Philip Lewis is a Charlotte-based lawyer who wrote this amazing novel that I really enjoyed called The Barrowfields that I've been recommending to everybody. George Singleton wrote this just hilarious novel about the rural people of South Carolina called Work Shirts for Mad Men. And so my question is, what is it about the Carolinas that they produce so much writing talent?
I get this question a lot. What is it about lawyers and writing? What is it about the South and writing? And I think that it's a couple different things. So let's talk about the lawyers first. There's this guy out there named John Grisham, and there's this other guy out there named Scott Turow. And, the way I like to think about it is, Grisham in particular, he lit a fire on a big tall hill and said, look what I'm doing. Doesn't this look like fun? And I pick on Grisham for two reasons. A, we're buddies now, but B, I was considering law school when his career first launched, really wanted to write a book. In fact, I had outlined a novel, never had the courage to write it. But as the firm was blowing up, I was thinking about law school. And then I was in law school as his career really exploded. And I'm one of these guys. I know that lawyers have different attitudes about what they do for a living. And I know loads who love it. My sister was an attorney for 30 years and loved every minute of it. And I've got lots of friends in the law who love it. I was never one of those guys. For me, I found my way to the law for all the wrong reasons. I always told myself, if I don't have life figured out by 30, I'm gonna go to law school. And anybody that's where we are, where you are, that's been through law school, gets all this, knows that is the wrong reason to go to law school. But at the time, it made sense to me. So I think that there's this draw because guys like Grisham and Turow have just had such a visual impact on what you can do as a lawyer that gets into writing. So I think as a lawyer, that spoke to me. Now, as a Southerner and as a Carolinian, I would wager that if you corralled all the states that have the same level of education, whether it's grade school up to university, and put them in a pot and shifted them around, you'd find the same amount of talent in all of these states in terms of raw writing talent. I think that there's a special thing about the South, however, and I've put some thought into this over the years. I think those of us that grew up in the South, and I certainly consider North Carolina a large part of the South, there's such a sense of history here. We were a conquered nation. We were a proud nation. And not that I rise and fall on memories of those years, but it there's a keeping of story in the South that I don't think you necessarily find in the Midwest or in California. Because we all had relatives who lost and suffered and died. And combined with that, the fact that the South was so agrarian for so long, there's a real connection to the land here. And I'm sure that people in New Hampshire would say the same thing. And people in California would say the same thing. But, the South, right? Before air conditioning, it was sweltering hot and people were out on their front porches waiting for that breath of a breeze and talking to the neighbors that walked by. Memories of the land, connections to the land, dependence on the land. I think that it just makes for a sense of identity that is an easy thing to mine as a storyteller. And a lot of Southern writers are drawn to that.
Well, and I think that sense, that culture of storytelling really rings true in your books. I think there are a lot of people who write about the South, and it feels like that they are just strapping it on, kind of like a Southern accent that sounds like Scarlett O'Hara instead of, what folks actually talk like. Is that something that you have consciously cultivated as you write, or is it just, the immersion and being from North Carolina? That's how your writing reads.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I mean, it's really easy to write sort of the stereotypical South, all hunting dogs and magnolias and sweet tea and all these things. And I've seen a lot of writers that do that. I try to write the real South. I don't like the term the New South. I don't know why that troubles me. It seems made up. But the real South is complicated, and it's not stereotypes. And you got a lot of success and wealth in the South. You got a lot of entrenched poverty in the South. You got a lot of anger in the South, resentment in the South, but also deep love in the South. And so I think it's important to understand the place one is writing about. And I have that just from having spent my life there. And I'll tell you this, and it kind of ties back into the law thing. I feel like I always thought I knew the South. And I realized in my 30s when I began my criminal practice that I did not. What I knew was the sheltered South, and what someone now would call white privilege, and that's a whole nother story. But I was raised in a protected home in a good neighborhood. I didn't understand the types of things that happened down at the bottoms of these hollows and at the ends of red dirt streets with burned out trailers on both sides. And I got into criminal practice and I realized, there is a lot of violence that I was never aware of in this county in which I grew up. I mean, and I don't even know why I'm saying white privilege, except for the fact that it's just such a catchphrase these days, because most of the people that were suffering that I dealt with were actually entrenched, desperately poor whites that had been, living in the same dead end little part of the county forever and dealing with the same dead end jobs or the loss of those same dead end jobs. And that helplessness and that hopelessness showed me really that there's such a great divide in the South of haves and have nots, at least where I grew up and where I set my first few novels. Salisbury, North Carolina is where I'm from and where those first two books were set. And it's at one point it had more millionaires per capita than any city in the country. And that was because of Food Line, which made a lot of, Food Line millionaires, but it also had more poverty than a lot of places. And so growing up where you had all these unbelievably wealthy families and 2 blocks away, this entrenched poverty, it made for great backdrop for stories.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask is, all right, so you get into your criminal practice and you start seeing what you hadn't seen before. And so how does that affect your writing?
Well, at that time, I was barely writing. And let me just give a 20-second explanation of that. By the time I was in criminal practice, I'd written 2 failed novels, one during a master's program and one I wrote while in law school. They should have never been published. They were unpublishable. But the last page I wrote was 20 times better than the very first page I wrote. So the learning curve was going in the right direction. What happened when I was practicing criminal law is that I realized so much about crime and the human element of crime. You'd read these high profile Dan Brown type thrillers and there's always some criminal mastermind with the great plan, right? And some people love writing that big kind of fiction. I never was drawn to that. what I learned in my time in criminal practice is that the people that I knew, the people that I represented, there are no criminal masterminds in Rowan County, North Carolina. I mean, these are people who make short-sighted, base decisions for selfish, hurried reasons, and have no idea of the consequences that are going to spill out from them. And so what I like to write about, and this is what I learned from my time in the law, are the ripple effects that come out of these crimes, whatever they are. Because none of these defendants truly understand what flows from these bad deeds, what it does to families of victims, communities, churches, schools, children. Pick an affected subgroup. And that's powerful fiction to kind of get into that, and then to really explore why it is that people do bad things. And I will on occasion, dabble with the higher, high order crime, a real criminal genius. But for the most part, that's not what interests me. And that's kind of what I learned from my time in the law.
But I'll tell you that my first summer of law school, I went into law school thinking, well, I taught high school for 6 years, so I was a little later going in too. And I thought that I wanted to do criminal prosecution. And so I spent a summer at the district attorney's office in one of the rural counties in Alabama here. And what I saw is what you're describing of the same people in the system for 40 years, making the same poor decisions at age 60 that they were making as a teenager. And it didn't take me long to realize, like, I can't spend my life doing this. I'm glad there are people who can on both sides of it, but I knew that I couldn't do that. So I can really identify with that. Moving ahead a little bit in your writing journey, I know for a lot of authors, it takes a while to break through and have success with book sales. What did that look like for you?
Well, I got lucky if we discount the first two failed novels.
Sure.
And when I say failed, let me tell you what I mean. No one wanted to represent it. No one wanted to publish it. 1,000 hours of work. And the only thing I got from it was a better understanding of how to do this thing called writing. So having written 2 books in 2 different graduate schools, finding myself out in criminal practice with a stay-at-home wife and a brand new daughter, I really wanted to try a third, swing at the brass ring to see if I couldn't possibly make this publishing thing work. But it's frightening at that point because the stakes are a little higher. And I'd been kind of a baby lawyer for a few years, meaning I was not dealing with the truly evil people yet. I was dealing with the sour butter we spread on our bread in criminal district court, the stupid, short-sighted idiots that ruin everybody's lives, but they're not really evil. I got to the point where I was starting to brush up against the evil, the killers and the rapists. And I had one guy in particular. I was court appointed on a child molester who had abused his 4-year-old stepdaughter. He did it. He told me he did it and wanted to know how I was going to fix it. And I decided at that point I didn't want to be a criminal defense attorney because that was sort of the line for me. I had a brand new daughter, right? And I get all the intellectual arguments. I just decided that, I just didn't want to do it. Well, the appointing judge didn't want to hear that. My law firm didn't want to hear that. So I decided, maybe this is my clarion call that it is time to try one more time to become a writer, with the idea that the first 2 efforts had been kind of split attention, part-time writer, part-time student. And I knew that if I was going to be a good lawyer, a good father, I couldn't be a good writer as well. So I decided to walk away from my practice with my wife's blessing and try one last time to write a book. And so I wrote a book about a young disaffected attorney in Salisbury, North Carolina, working in the criminal justice. Didn't much like why he was there. And the book it was called The King of Lies, and it became all about why he chose his profession. As it turned out, he followed his father into the field. And his father was like this big, larger than life, big attorney. And so I gave myself a year to write it, and I did it in 11 months and change. I won't bore you with the details of the 4 years it took me to get it published, which it did take 4 years. When I finally got an offer, I thought, well, this is, my agent called, and this is the call we all want. Hey, man, you don't have to work this job anymore. And so in my mind's eye, I was stripping diplomas off the walls and packing up my office. And then he finished his sentence, and he said, "You've been offered $7,500 for your first novel." And just like that, whoop, everything's back on the walls. I mean, I can't I can't quit my job for $7,500. But as luck would have it, the book took off like a scalded cat. It landed on the New York Times bestseller list, and ended up, I think, in 13 or 14 different languages, and did really well in a lot of those countries. And so they offered me a contract for more books, and I was able to quit and walk away. And every one of those following books did better than the last. I started at number 23 on the list, then 18, then 15, and then in the top 10. And I've never broken in the top 5, but life goes on, and I'm hopeful. But it pays the bills, and I've been able to kind of relocate to a farm up in Virginia and do this full time for a while now. So it's been good.
Well, I think that really speaks to perseverance in putting aside the first 2, writing the third one, and then keeping the faith as it made the rounds. And I read something in an interview you said that I want to read back to you and ask you about is you said, I think the main difference between being a published and an unpublished writer is perseverance. You have to write day after day with no monetary compensation. You just have the faith that you can do it. And it's a brutally difficult thing to do, to spend that much time in what is, in essence, a thankless task beyond the pleasure of writing. I put grad school and on hold. I quit careers to do this. What was it about the writing that was so compelling to you that you felt you had to do those things and get it done?
So, all right, man, there's so much to unpack in that question. What I learned in the law, and I'm going to start here, is that what matters to me is how I spend my hours and minutes, because those build the days that build your life. And I always considered creative writing, novel writing, if successful, to be the ultimate expression of personal freedom. And what I mean by that is that if you can do it well enough to have committed readers and publishers that believe in you, you can live where you want, write what you want, work as you like. Your life, you become the complete and total master of your time. So in the broader scope, that's what appealed to me. Now, do I love writing? Absolutely. Is writing hard and lonesome and frustrating as heck sometimes? Yeah. I mean, it can be soul crushing when it doesn't go well. And I often describe the writing of a novel as a year-long sustained leap of faith. Sometimes it's 2 years. It once took me 4 years, because no one can look over your shoulder and say you're doing it right, because they don't know what's in your head. They don't see the vision you're trying to deliver. People can say, I like what I've read so far, but maybe they're just being nice. And that's the writer's insecurity. You hear that and you think, okay, well, that's just someone protecting my feelings. So for me, it was really goal-oriented. I wanted the lifestyle. And then I found that all of the uncertainty that goes into writing a novel, and I mean, waking up at 2 a.m. and not knowing what you're going to write the next day and feeling like your kids are going to starve if you don't figure it out. That all evaporates very quickly when the novel comes out and becomes a bestseller, and you get to do things like have these interviews with you, Jeremy, and you realize that, there are people that care about this stuff and people that are interested. And when I was doing criminal defense law, I never really felt that people other than my clients were that interested. The clients were interested. My wife wasn't that interested. My friends weren't that interested. And I'm making a joke. I mean, obviously there's a lot going on in that business, but I don't know, man. I really just wanted it. And there's no easy stepping stone path to getting it. And so it often is a matter of just unwavering conviction, or the overcoming of the crushing of that conviction and building it again and starting all over, which is what I had to do after each failed novel. But I've met so many best-selling novelists that have those 2 or 3 failed books in a drawer. And to your point, it is a question of perseverance, because I could have easily quit after either of those first 2.
Well, I think that's interesting. What you just said. I interviewed an author, Barbara Hinsky, yesterday, who wrote, among many books, one of the books she wrote was, the protagonist was a girl who lost her vision on her honeymoon. And, she practiced for 30 years, most of that in-house, and then started writing novels when she got close to retiring. And she said that after she wrote that novel, a man reached out to her who had lost his vision as an adult and just told her how much that novel meant to her and helped him keep the faith as he was learning this new lifestyle. And so I think, like you said, there's so much depth and opportunity to reach people with writing fiction that isn't there, or is there in a different way with, the cases that we handle, because most of mine is corporate litigation and it's insurance companies, and there aren't a lot of people that have long-term interest in the results of it. And whereas, when I read a book that, there's books I read that I'm going to remember scenes from those books for the rest of my life.
Yeah, well, I'm the same way. I think about Prince of Tides. There's some scenes there I haven't forgotten since 1986 when I read it as a young man. But here's the difference, and this is what I struggle with as a lawyer, is there is so much of your minutes and your hours that is spent in adversarial pursuit. And I just never really enjoyed that. I mean, I have a lot of friends that they'd love it. I mean, they thrive on it. They can't wait to get, into fisticuffs, so to speak. And I never found that way. But in terms of people's response to novels, if a novel is done right, it's an escape vehicle. And if you do it really well, you bring your reader into that escape vehicle and you achieve escape velocity very, very quickly. And suddenly all the troubles of the workaday world disappear. And the law, at least as I practice it, was the exact opposite. The more time I spent with the people, in that circle, meaning mostly clients, et cetera, the more real things became and the higher the stakes became. And, and the harder it was for me to sleep at night and the more I worried. And, the stakes in novel writing, they're high for my family and they're high for my financial well-being, but nobody's going to be falsely imprisoned if I don't do it right.
Yeah. All right. One of the things that I enjoy about your books is, because thrillers generally are not what I read a lot of, but what I enjoy about your books is that they are thrillers with depth and dimension. And obviously with talking with you, I can tell that you're a person who's introspective and thinks a lot about those things. I read in an interview where you try to write books that your wife will not just enjoy, but respect. So how do you intertwine those things so effectively of, it's not just a surface level thriller, but there's really some meat to it?
Well, thank you for perceiving what I do in that manner. I appreciate it because I've tried real hard to achieve that. Look, I'm an escapist by nature. I pick up a book. I love realizing that 4 hours have passed and I've been unaware of them. So I've always liked to read those kinds of books. And so when I first tried this business, I tried to write those books. Now, I could probably do that now. I don't know that I would enjoy it. Those first two books, the failed books, they didn't deliver, anything of worth. There was no escape velocity at all. So it is important who we live with and how they feel about what we do for our lives. And we want to wake up and feel like they value us, not just as a paycheck, earner, but as someone who actually, is doing something that they respect. So yeah, that matters. My wife is really smart. She was an English major at Duke. She did really well. She gave up a lot of opportunity to stay home and raise our kids. And so, what she thinks has always mattered a lot. And what I realized when I say she likes to read literary fiction, and that's always been kind of a dirty word to thriller writers, literary, it's, that's a loaded word. And what that often means is there could be a 3-page, moment of staring at the sunlight as it reflected off the dishwater onto some towel and hanging by the window, and what that really means about life. And no, I don't play that game. I don't want to play that game. I want to be pulled through the pages at some serious velocity. However, what I kind of figured out in trying to do both, and my publishers have been really kind of keen on this. They like to describe me as a literary thriller writer. And I don't know that term's been bandied around a lot. And I might have lost some sales because of that, because, most thriller writers don't care about the literary part. But what it means to me is just spending a lot of time building the characters in a manner that they're so real that the stakes matter more. Meaning you don't have to put an antimatter bomb, whatever the hell that is,
sure,
in the catacombs under Vatican City to buy an emotional response from your reader. If you can make them live and breathe with these characters, understand and fret and worry and suffer with these characters, and as if it's their own heart beating, then you can buy that same emotional response with much smaller stakes. And that can be as simple as freedom or prison, life or death, happiness or sadness or brokenness or healing. And so you can create the same emotional intensity without the gimmicks. But it's important to make those characters super credible, and that's about backstory, motive. I mean, all lawyers should understand this. What motivates a character? Why do they think the way they do? Why are they willing to take these chances? Why would they walk through fire to save a child they've never known? Or why would they burn down a house to spite someone who, didn't harm them as much as they think? It's important that we understand these things. And so that's about backstory, motivation, but done in an economical way, because you can't browbeat the reader. You've got to give them just enough information. And that's the balancing act. How do you give them just enough information to fill in the picture from their own experiences? That's what makes it a rich, integrative experience between reader and writer. I figured out that really mattered. And it turns out I enjoy doing that, and I'm good at it. And the other thing is attention to language. And and maybe this is from my time in the law, because language matters so much. And writing really evocative prose without tipping over into the purple side of things, because that's my weakness. I can write a purple phrase. I mean, I can overwrite the hell out of a scene. So I've learned to kind of dial that in and find a balance of being evocative without being overwritten. And I guess those are the things that I would say that I try to do that have worked for me.
Well, I will say that I think you do it well, because there are two scenes particularly from, now I'm drawing a blank on the title. Okay, it's the book. The brother comes back from maybe New York or having been somewhere up north for a while, comes back to North Carolina.
This is Iron House you're talking about, my fourth novel.
Okay. And there's a couple scenes from that book that have just stayed. And I think that speaks to the description and the emotional response to the book. And so, yeah, if that's what you're trying to achieve, then I think you're doing it.
Well, I'll give you an example. Like this is my personal sort of barometer about the power of character. It's the story arc that keeps us reading until 3 a.m, and that's super important. But years later, it's the characters that we remember. And so for me, I mentioned this earlier, Prince of Tides by Pat Conroy. I mean, a great dynamo of a book. And I don't aspire or pretend to ever achieve what Pat achieved. But the lesson I learned from him was that 30 years later now, or 35 years later, I still remember the people that he wrote. I don't remember the plot, but I remember those people.
Yeah.
And, that's a real buy-in.
So when you get ready to start a new project, are you starting with characters, or are you starting with a plot, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's okay. So the new book that comes out in a couple of days is called The Unwilling, and it's set in Charlotte in 1972, shadow of the Vietnam War, and it's about a family that has 3 sons. 2, the older brothers, went to Vietnam. 1 died. 1 came back, decorated, disgraced, and addicted to heroin. And it's the story of the younger brother who's about to graduate from high school and trying to decide whether to enlist, even though he has a college deferment. And then there's, serial killers and lost loves and all kinds of stuff in this novel. You can't start with that much stuff. It's too much. At least I can't. There may be writers that are smarter than me. I get into arguments with Grisham all the time. He'll spend months and outline his books before he writes the first bit of prose, because he knows exactly what he's doing. I'm not smart enough to see the whole picture when I start. I need to build from a really solid stepping stone, a beginning point. And for me, that is the main character and maybe 1 or 2 others. And so what I must have, and every time I've tried to write a book without having this, I've screwed the pooch. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. I need to know whose story I'm telling, why they matter, what they care about, and what they want and what they're afraid of, and all of these things that make us individuals in the emotional sense. And then I just try to find a plot line that I can spin them along that allows these things to evolve and be addressed. And, and of course I write crime fiction, so it's usually about murder and mayhem and, all kinds of bad things. And it then becomes a question of how do these characters respond to this evil, whatever it is. Oh, shoot. I forgot. I told you I was going to come back to something. Do you remember what I said I was going to come back to?
You were going to come back to screwing the pooch because you didn't have those things.
Oh, screwing the pooch. Yes. Thank you. God, this is, I'll tell you why I blocked on that, because I've blocked it. This is the most painful part of my career. So I wrote my first four novels. I did it exactly that way. I knew the character, and then I went in search of a story a story to be worthy of these characters and the growth arc that they had to go, right? Because you don't want to, these people can't be the same at the end of the book as they were at the beginning. They have to grow and change, and you want to be along for the ride. So I did 4 books. They were all bestsellers. 2 of them won Edgar Awards for Best Novel, which was a pretty huge thing for me. And I got a little cocky. I mean, hubris is a real thing. And I like to think it was not the kind of hubris that made me a pain in the ass at cocktail parties, but I just started to think I really knew what I was doing. Like, I really had it all figured out. And so when I started book 5, I did not start with that same stepping stone. I didn't have the character. I didn't understand whose story I was telling. I figured, you know what? I've done this 4 times successfully. I'm just going to start writing, and it's all going to come to me. 50 pages in, I wasn't so sure. 150 pages in, I had some serious doubts, but I'd written 150 pages. Let's write another 100 pages. And the whole time I'm trying to shove things into order. I spent a year writing a book that should have never been written before I called my publisher and my editor. And I said, look, I'm not going to make my deadline. This book's not good enough. And so after a lot of painful reflection, I threw out a year's work. I mean, a year's labor. That was hard. And I learned a valuable lesson then, that it's so important to know whose story I'm telling. From those 300 discarded pages, there was a very minor character, a young female cop, who became the protagonist of what is my 5th novel. It's Redemption Road, first female protagonist I've ever written. In fact, I'm writing a sequel to that book now. But it was a very painful lesson. I mean, a year of my life before I learned an inviolable, I will never forget. For me, character first. If I don't know who that is, I'm in trouble. So that was a hard one.
All right. So what is it about the characters in The Unwilling that drew you to write a story about the Vietnam era, or that's set during the Vietnam era?
No, that's a great question. So the book is set in 1972. It's in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had to dirty the city up a little bit. It wasn't as big or as violent as I made it out to be, but I had to do it. I'm going to say first something about the title. I didn't want to set a novel in Vietnam because I was 7 in 1972. I'm not qualified to write the war. But I wanted to set a novel in that era because I remembered older kids that were scared of the draft, that thought they should fight, whose fathers wanted them to fight. I remember all of this. So it's really a family drama crime story about what it's like in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the shadow of the Vietnam War, for this one family who sends their 2 older sons to fight. One is killed. One turns into an absolutely soul-crushing warrior. Just terrifying, good at what he does. Just a great warrior who nevertheless, after 3 tours, is discharged dishonorably, and he comes home addicted to drugs and violence and ends up in the most notorious prison in the state. I wanted to set it in 1972 just to see if I could. No cell phones, no internet. How do you recapture the feeling of that time? I can still feel it, and yet it seems simple, right? Because I was a child, but as an adult, I know now the nation was polarized. There was Watergate, there was, inflation, gas was through the roof. There was Nixon, Kent State shootings, riots in northern prisons. And, there's all kinds of stuff tearing the country apart. So it felt like kind of a topical, timely era, to sort of compare with what we are now. And we came through that and blah, blah, blah. It was great. So the title came to me from a quote from an unknown soldier, and it's really brief. I'm going to read it real fast. I thought it captures the Vietnam War really well. We, the unwilling, led by the unqualified, to kill the unfortunate, die for the ungrateful. So that's where the title comes from. But, the title is just the front cover. Where does the story come from, was your question. There was an amazing thing that happened in Vietnam, dark and light, both extremes. So in 1968, for whatever reason that I will never understand, a company of American soldiers, poorly led and ravaged by war and temporarily insane, I can only imagine, decided that the thing to do was to slaughter an entire village of South Vietnamese civilians. I mean, there was no reason for this. There was no VC there. There was no threat. They found no weapons. For whatever reason, this company of soldiers just began systematically slaughtering these villagers. I mean, it's horrible. You can read about it. It became known as the My Lai Massacre. And there was the really bright shining moment of that was a young helicopter pilot in a small helicopter with a 2-man crew understood what was happening and literally put themselves between the villagers and these kind of war-crazed Americans that were just shooting everything in sight. And, they literally faced them down with machine guns and ordered them to stand down. And they rescued untold civilians. I mean, they saved countless lives. But it was such a disaster because the military decided that what they needed to do was cover it up. So they covered it up and they vilified this helicopter crew for about a year until Seymour Hersh broke the story in 1969 and won a Pulitzer for it. And, it led to trial, national outrage. It was really just a bad time. But for 30 more years, these helicopter crewmen were punished. I mean, they were vilified. They were denied promotion. I mean, the military really hated them for blowing the whistle. They were eventually given one of the highest honors the armed services can give. And now they're considered heroes for doing the right thing in impossible circumstances. Okay, that's a long story. The reason I tell it is that this idea of courage, regardless of consequence, is so powerful to me, and I think to humanity as well. That these helicopter crewmen would risk their own lives to save these people that they had nothing in common with other than humanity. It inspired the character of Jason French, who is the surviving older brother, who was this fierce warrior who came back under these really strange circumstances under a cloud and ends up in the world of heroin and gun running and outlaw motorcycle gangs, and what happens when he wants to reconnect with his 18-year-old brother who's trying to figure out what it means to be a man. So it's so this really simple conceit, this little nugget of an idea that grew into an entire book. Show me a character that's is selfless and fearless as Hugh Thompson Jr., who led this helicopter crew, and then find a story that will, elucidate these qualities. How can I reveal this guy in a way that's relevant and that I can write, keeping in mind I can't write about the war itself because I don't know a damn thing about it.
Yeah.
And so that's how stories begin. And then you just spend countless waking hours and sleepless nights trying to figure out how to do it.
Well, I love hearing about that. And I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to stop the interview there. But by the time this comes out next week, the book will already come out because it comes out on the 2nd. Tell folks where they can follow you or purchase your books.
Yeah, well, okay. So this is what I do for a living. It's my great passion and my great release. I hate social media though, so I'm not very good at it. I am on Facebook. It's John Hart Author. I am on Instagram, John Hart Author. Technically, I'm on Twitter, but the whole idea of 140 characters is insane to me. You can follow me, but I don't say much there. Books should be everywhere. The books are sold, audio, Kindle, hardcover. I have a great publisher, and they do a really good job of getting these books out everywhere. I'm not sure about some of the foreign stuff yet, but in terms of this country, you can find it if you want it.
Great. Thanks so much for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Please take time to rate and subscribe at whatever podcatcher you're listening on. And if you want more from me, you can find me at jeremywrichter.com. You can also find me on Twitter at RichterJW. And if you want the extra audio and benefits available at Patreon, you can become a patron at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. Thanks for listening.